Roger Kimball. Can you hear me? Yes, there we go. I'm Roger Kimball. I'm the chairman of the William F. Buckley Jr. program at Yale. I'm delighted you all could come. And it's certainly a great honor to have Henry Kissinger with us tonight. I think I first met Henry at Bill Buckley's house many years ago. And it was through Bill and Pat that I became friendly with Henry and Nancy. So this is like old home week. We're delighted to be here. Now, in the category of people who need no introduction, Henry Kissinger certainly stands at the head of that list. Were that not so, I would tell you that he was born in Germany in interesting times. If everyone in the room did not know it, I would also remind you that for various reasons, he came to this country in 1938, even more interesting times. Something was happening in Germany back then, yes. If everyone did not already know it, I would remind you that he spent many years after doing some army service, both in the United States and again in Europe during that interesting period. He spent quite a bit of time at Harvard University. Took a couple, nobody's perfect. Took a couple of degrees there and taught many people, probably some people in this room. He went on to become an advisor to Nelson Rockefeller. I believe that is where he met Nancy. He was the National Security Advisor for Richard Nixon, then Secretary of State. He's written a shelf full of books, 3 volumes of memoirs, a brilliant book on the Congress of Vienna, which I will revert to a bit later. And did you not already know this? I would also mention that he's written many best-selling books, a book on diplomacy, more recently, a big book on China called, appropriately, On China, a kind of companion volume that those in the room who remember the Beatles, it sort of looks like the Beatles' White Album. There's On China and then World Order, and there they are in their white covers looking just very pristine. So as I say, if Henry Kissinger needed no introduction, if he did need an introduction, I would tell you all these things. But I felt it was appropriate, since this program is named for William F. Buckley Jr., that to indulge in this sort of extended example of praeteritio, one of Bill Buckley's favorite rhetorical terms, or the Greek for that is apophasis. So this means saying something by not saying it. So now that we know who Henry Kissinger is, we can have a little conversation about various things. Now, Lauren already mentioned the contretemps at New York University, so I'm not going to go into that except to mention that the people who accosted Dr. Kissinger came from a wide variety of organizations. For example, the Democratic Socialists of America, NYU Against Fascism, and the NYU branch of the International Socialist Organization. So we know where their money was spent. Now I thought we thought we'd take a page from that philosopher Johnny Mercer tonight, and accentuate the positive rather than retail a long list of horror stories about the academy. Dr. Kissinger has been around for a few years, and so this is the silliness that we see today is not his first experience of silliness. It reminds me of what might be Karl Marx's most amusing possibly his only amusing observation, in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon, where, taking a page from Hegel, he said that, Hegel was right that history tends to repeat itself, but he forgot to add, the first time as tragedy, the second time as farce. Now, I don't know whether we are in this second stage of history repeating itself, but I would love to have Henry's thoughts about how things differ now from the late 1960s, when you were there, in the Nixon administration. People were rioting in the streets. I don't believe there were calls for safe spaces, for trigger warnings, offers of puppies, and special rooms to cry in when Richard Nixon, or indeed when you came on the television. So I'd be curious to know, Henry, how things differed then from the way they are now.
Well, first of all, let me say, I occasionally hear the phrase that few people need an introduction less than I do. But it is even more true that even fewer people enjoy an introduction more. So you did very well in relation. Now, when I was security advisor, I had, of course, before that, been a Harvard professor. And so I saw the evolution of the Vietnam protest. I was in favor of the strategy that was pursued then, and so was a great part of the faculty during the Kennedy period, when it was started. So I have seen the transformation of these faculty members. The difference between now and then was that at that time the memory of a free debate still existed, and the opponents did not suppress expressions of the other point of view. They organized riots and demonstrations, and it got progressively nastier. But in the early phases of the Vietnam protests, it was possible to hear defenses of the existing policy. And you have to remember, that policy was not started by Nixon. Nixon inherited 500,000 troops that were already in place. And his task was how to withdraw them under honorable conditions. That was the key issue at that time. So I, by chance, saw a television special the other night, which was even-handedly called Tricky Dick. So that
keeping the audience
you could
on tenterhooks.
in suspense about what might come next. And by the end of the Nixon administration, the debate had also totally deteriorated. But the the difference seems to me to be, at that time there was at least a policy issue. Now the attack is on American values, and America is described as a sexist, racist, and the students or the audience is described as being too sensitive to be able to hear arguments with which they disagree.
Yes.
So the arguments are suppressed.
Yes, I think that's true, and I wonder, trying to put this into a broader context. So we hear a lot about the suppression of free speech on campuses and elsewhere. That's certainly a prominent fact. But you have you've written about something I think stands behind this phenomenon. I remember many years ago you wrote a review for the New York Times book review. I no longer remember what you were reviewing or whether you liked the book, but I do remember and savor your description of the graduates of the École Normale Supérieure, and you said that they know everything. Unfortunately, that is all they know.
They don't know anything else.
And recently you wrote something I'd like to read to the audience, and perhaps you could comment on this. I wonder whether this phenomenon, this intellectual phenomenon, is not a spring for the kinds of intolerance, at least one spring for the kinds of intolerance we see. You write, "We have entered a time of total change in human consciousness of how people look at the world. Reading books requires you to form concepts, to train your mind to relationships. You have to come to grips with who you are. A leader needs these qualities. But now we learn from fragments of facts. A book is a large intellectual construction. You can't hold it all in the mind easily or at once. You have to struggle mentally to internalize it. Now, there is no need to internalize because each fact can be instantly called up on the computer. There is no context, no motive. Information is not knowledge. People are not readers, but researchers. They float on the surface. This new thinking erases context. It disaggregates everything. All this makes strategic thinking about the world order impossible to achieve." I wonder if you think that those comments about some of the liabilities that people must face as they try to engage in strategic thinking about the world also infects their larger intellectual capacity to engage in fruitful discussion with other people who may not share their point of view.
Many of these points you're quoting were intended as descriptions of the impact of the contemporary technology on thinking. When research really becomes the finding of relevant quotations to points of view you have pretty well already decided, the conceptualization you get from reading books gradually disintegrates. And opinions are formed by creating groupings of individuals who share common emotions and who are swept away by more or less agreed attitudes. And I think this is a fundamental cultural problem now. It can't be ascribed to individual groupings, but it leads to a deterioration of dialogue in the universities, and it makes it very difficult for political leaders to become something more than a collection of emotions. And I think this is very threatening to democracy and to the ability to deal with really complex issues that need to be dealt with over a period of time and that can't be encapsulated in the emotion of one moment.
Yes, I agree. Now, as an illustration of that, we were talking the other day about your alma mater, Harvard, and the fact that I think it's the dean, anyway, he's, faculty dean Ronald S. Sullivan at Winthrop House has been engaged by Harvey Weinstein to defend him, to be his lawyer. And there's been a great outcry at Harvard over this. How dare he? This is threatening to the students, that there have been protests and so on. Mr. Sullivan, to these charges that it's absolutely morally unacceptable and so on, pointed out that America's legal system rests on a presupposition of innocence, for one thing, and that people deserve to be vigorously defended. How do you think that phenomenon at Harvard, a great university, if I may say that in this august chamber, what does that tell us? That here the cream of the crop, these people protesting that the monster Harvey Weinstein should be entitled to legal representation. What does that tell us?
I have to say, in defense of my alma mater, they made it possible for me to go there after the war and to find a definition of my purposes in an atmosphere that was heavily democratic. It was rare to meet a Republican at Harvard, but the atmosphere was one in which dialogue was still permitted and was taken for granted. What I find so disturbing is the argument that if a student or anybody has to hear an argument that he doesn't agree with, that so wounds him that he needs special protection for his suffering. Growing up means coming to grips with things that you have to deal with and that you cannot fully control. And I ask myself, what happens to these students when they're 50 and life is rough and they have to ask themselves about the consequences of what they have seen, and they have not prepared themselves to deal with controversy. I mean, our friend Bill Buckley, he thrived on hearing arguments
Yes.
that he disagreed with. He welcomed this opportunity. He constructed institutions or exercises. He did not agree. He was as important in my life as nobody whom I would say was more important. And nevertheless, when I went on his television program, he introduced me by saying, Henry Kissinger reminds me of an athlete who is carried on the shoulders of the throng around the arena while somebody else is winning the race. But Bill and I knew that this was an argument within, it was essentially a tactical argument, how you dealt with the problem of the Soviet Union. There was no question that we were closely allied in the ultimate objective. But my basic point is that Bill Buckley was not threatened by Galbraith, who really disagreed with him. And to have a vital society, you need people that have confidence in their beliefs, that have acquired them in serious discussions, and then work on bringing about their convictions. And that was the essence of Bill Buckley, and that's what a great society does. You can never have an assured guarantee of all your preferences. In fact, you can't even be sure that your preferences remain totally stable throughout your life. But you can have confidence in your convictions if you have achieved them in some sort of debate that grants the good faith of the other side, and that does not begin every debate with the need to suppress the arguments you oppose or to question the motivations. And that is the enormous change that has occurred in most American universities.
Yes, I guess 50 is 50 is the new 15 now, I guess. So people remain perpetual adolescents. And there seems to be two sides to this phenomenon. You mentioned the hypersensitivity, the feeling of woundedness whenever challenged. What goes along with that, though, is a presumption of moral superiority, and the growth of a kind of church that has only one ritual, namely excommunication. So, and I just wonder that what this tells us about the health of our universities. Is this just a tiny phenomenon, or is it really quite widespread? And what it tells us beyond the situation in the universities, what it tells us about our society at large. After all, institutions like Yale, like Harvard, and other lesser institutions are bringing, they're inculcating the future. They're teaching the future leaders of our society. Do you think that these phenomena are sort of an epiphenomenal, or does it say something more deeply about the texture of the West?
To some degree, it tells us something about the texture of the West. Because to have statesmanship or policy making is to help move your society from where it is to where it has never been. So it requires courage and vision, and within that, you must be able to tolerate, not only tolerate controversy, but use it to draw from it a positive direction. But when you start with a process which is really a kind of enforced conversion, how do you then go on through the rest of life and through the rest of contests that occur between societies? So, and I believe when you, in history courses, if they're still taught, if you look at the evolution of the great societies, they have always believed in the basic orientation of their values, but they also believed in the importance of learning from the variety of experiences. And how to mesh these, that is the art of moving through complex periods. And we are really living in as complex a period, I would say the most complex period that I can think of. So this is not just an issue to me of arguing with faculties about what courses they should teach, but about the attitude that they are asking the students to learn and exemplify. And I am concerned that if that continues for any length of time, that we will weaken ourselves for the main tasks that are ahead of us.
To bring it down to a matter of contemporary politics, do you think that the attitude toward the president, as expressed by the elites, is an example of this kind of intolerance, or is it something else?
I lived through the Watergate period on the inside of an administration. And certainly grave mistakes had been made. But if you are in high office, the ability of your country to deal with crisis can never be forgotten. So when the public debate takes the forms it has done now in the last decades, I'm concerned about whether we're not sliding into a period where the losing party focuses on using the legal procedures to remove the opponent from office. And therefore, no coherent policy can emerge. And that does not mean that I agree with the current administration. in the topics on which they are often being attacked.
Yes, I wonder, there's a new congresswoman in New York called Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and she made this statement recently that she hoped that someday, America would be in a position where people would be able to live under prosperity. They didn't currently, according to her. I don't want to say anything about how foolish that statement is, but I would like to read a few sentences from this marvelous book on the Congress of Vienna, which I recommend to all of you, A World Restored. I think it was your first book. And you're talking about sort of the larger context of that time, and I wonder if there are any lessons we might, or admonitions we might draw from it to our profit today. You say that the achievements of the Congress of Vienna were not inconsiderable. A period of peace lasting almost 100 years, a stability so pervasive that it may have contributed to disaster. For in the long interval of peace, the sense of the tragic was lost. It was forgotten that states could die, that upheavals could be irretrievable, that fear could become the means of social cohesion. The hysteria of joy which swept over Europe at the outbreak of the First World War was the symptom of a fatuous age, but also a secure one. It revealed a millennial faith, a hope for the world which had all the blessings of the Edwardian age, made all the more agreeable by the absence of armament races and of the fear of war. What minister who declared war in August 1914 would not have recoiled with horror had he known the shape of the world in 1918, not to speak of the present? Well, we haven't had a century of peace yet, but we have had a blossoming of prosperity unparalleled in history. And with that has come an incredible security, perhaps a false sense of security. But I wonder if you could reflect a little bit about our current situation, this prosperity, this sense of security, in the terms of some of the more Baroque examples of intolerance and so on that we're seeing across our society today, and whether you see any connections between what's happening now, or analogies, I should say, between what's happening now and what had happened after the Napoleonic Wars.
I think studying the history of July 1914, when the First World War broke out, should be a requirement for almost any statesman now who is conducting foreign policy. On July 1st, 1914, nobody in Europe thought that a war was imminent. By August 1st, they were locked in a conflict that killed tens of millions of people, and from which Europe has never recovered because it lost its self-confidence. So this is one of the key lessons we we have to understand. And there are two lessons in it, that any society needs great objectives, because if it confines itself to the familiar, it will stagnate and be torn apart by short-term conflicts. But it also has to know the limits. No European leader at the time had any idea of what a conflict would produce. And in fact, they had no idea that they wouldn't know how to stop it, because for 100 years, they had fought little wars of relatively short duration. Now we are in a world, and at that time there was no big ideological conflict in Europe. Now we live in a world in which there are significant ideological conflicts, and in which societies are in a process of transformation, and in which their leaders are concerned both with their domestic transformations and the international implications. But they're approaching it by different criteria, and in some situations they conduct their politics primarily in relation to domestic politics, which has a much shorter perspective, and that is occurring at a time when technology is rapidly advancing. A few years ago, I was at a conference, and I saw on the program artificial intelligence, which is not a problem I had frankly never addressed. And I thought I would catch up on my jet lag when a friend called me at the door and said, "This might be interesting for you to listen to as a historian." And I listened to a technocrat, or a techie, who was trying to develop computers with which he could challenge the champions of Korea and of China, and in the game of Go. And Go is a game that you start with 163 pieces and an empty board. So it's a highly conceptual game. And so I asked him afterwards how he was going to teach that computer to do this. And he said, "I'll make it play against itself. And I can make it play thousands of games." And he turned out to be right. The Asian opponents were defeated so completely that they quit after the 7th of 10 games because they thought there was no possible way. This has now evolved so that when they try to teach chess to a computer, the computer responded not just by playing chess better than it had been, but by inventing a new game of chess with the same rules as the old game. So I mention this for a number of reasons. One, if you're now a policymaker and you have weaponry that is based on this kind of technology, how can you calculate in any reasonable way if you believe, as many of us believed in the nuclear age, that you have to get to some limitations of usage and so forth. But how can you do that when you have weapons that can determine their own objective? So I mention this only to say we are moving into a world of unbelievable complexity. And what this example of the chess means to me is when we are now in a position to ask questions of inanimate objects to which we don't know the answer, the category of answer, we will find that this is a new evolution of the human mind. And I'm a novice in this. I was asked to give a speech at Stanford a few weeks ago, and I went to a group of scientists who were creating a center of artificial intelligence. And I began it by saying, this is a strange situation. You people have been working on and writing articles, and I've written exactly one article in my life on that subject. And now I've written a second one. And the point I'm trying to make is this. The people who've been writing the existing articles have been concerned with application. What do these things do? We need to ask, what are the implications? What does it mean for strategy and thinking? Now, when you look at these issues, and then when you look at our political debates in the newspapers, and when you see a plethora of candidates grabbing issues whose implications are minor, but even those are not being discussed, then you worry where we're going. And it isn't a question that America is doing worse than others. In most respects, we're doing better. But when nobody asks the fundamental questions and when there is no consensus about them in the world, then you worry about a chaotic outcome. And that's what intellectual leaders in the past have tried to avoid. That's what the great philosophers are about.
Two last questions, Henry. One, I think the word that you have used most often tonight is confidence. And I remember that our old friend James Burnham observed that usually civilizations died not from external invasion, but because of suicide. And this suicide was consequent upon a kind of existential crisis of confidence. One looks back to the British Empire in its heyday in the late 19th century. This was a country full of confidence and full of doing all kinds of things all around the world. I think the United States was a culture of great confidence in the late 40s and 50s to the early 60s. It's my impression that that confidence has wavered in recent decades, notwithstanding the fact that we've become ever richer and more technologically adept. I take it that confidence and that kind of cultural confidence is not something that can be simply willed into existence. But I wonder if you see any prospect for its recovery.
Well, first, you have to believe in its recovery. if you want to build your society to continue in any manner approximately like that for which it was designed. And I don't usually go around giving speeches on these subjects. You sort of elicited these answers by your questions, because I'm not 100% sure of all the answers I would give to these questions. But everybody talks, and I believe it's probably true, of the idealism of the younger generation. And if that is there, I hope that it can be crystallized for purposes other than the defeat of their tactical opponents in the current debates. And in America, I came here as an immigrant, and I learned about America in an infantry division that came from, because I was drafted shortly after I came here, and that was from Wisconsin and Illinois. And in that war, the sort of debates I have seen in recent American wars did not exist. There was a conviction, and of course we had an enemy of absolute evil in Hitler, so it was not. So I hope it can be recovered. I'm fairly confident it will be recovered in America. The big question to me is this: can we restore a Atlantic kind of notion so that the West, which is responsible for many of the great achievements of the human mind, can deal with them in a unified fashion? I think that is a big issue that we will face in the next decades. Because if we split up and then everything becomes tactical maneuvering on a Eurasian scale, then we run the risk of, as societies, repeating World War I type crises, which with modern weapons would be of unbelievable magnitude.
Indeed, my last question. From I read something from the beginning of your book on the Congress of Vienna. This is something from I think the last page, or last couple of pages anyway. I think it relates to what you just said. You say, a people may be aware of the probable consequences of a revolutionary situation, but its knowledge will be empty if it cannot recognize a revolutionary situation. Are we in a revolutionary situation now?
You know, one of the depressing things to me when people ask me about that book, this was my first book. And
next time, Henry, I'll bring World Order, and we'll talk about it.
So, but I can only repeat what I said then. You have to understand what you're trying to do. But then you have to recognize the phenomena that you see as being relevant to to these propositions. So it's not enough for a society to have great objectives. It has to be able to apply that conviction to the circumstances in which it finds itself. That's the challenge of greatness. But we've met it and the West is responsible for many transgressions and inhumanities, but also for many, if not most, of our great ideas. So it should have confidence and not just be obsessed with its shortcomings.
Thank you. I believe we have time for a few questions. We have time for a few questions. I cannot see the audience, so I'm going to rely on Lauren Noble to superintend who gets to ask the questions. There's a microphone, so please wait for the microphone.
Isn't the issue of suppression of differing ideas really about the extension of totalitarianism? And judging from your experience, having lived in an environment where that has happened and come to the United States with the belief that this would be a different place, to see this happen at this time, especially in university campuses, must be deeply disturbing. And I think, to my mind, that is the extension of what's happening today is really the extension of a totalitarian point of view and all of the negative things that come from it. Isn't that what you're ultimately concerned about, or not?
I don't want to get into the immediate American domestic debate that way, but I'll make a general other comment. The dilemma of policymaking is this. When you have an objective, you can define it clearly, and the natural view as a student or as anybody is to want it in its pure form. But in the real world of policymaking, you meet a lot of other people who have objectives of their own. So for most leaders, the issue becomes what partial result can keep the process going. And for really great leaders, they can then sometimes visualize how a series of partial results gets you to your absolute goal. But on the way there, it is rare that you can fulfill your pristine version of it. Now, at this moment, America is in a debate, and I can tell you my personal attitude at the beginning was there are many things I did not like. I did not want the current administration to be defeated in a domestic legal procedure. I wanted it, if it gets defeated, to be defeated in an election. Because if we get used to extra legal procedures by anybody, that was my attitude, but I didn't do much about it. I mean, I didn't participate in that debate, but that was my feeling about that debate. And contrary to many of my friends in New York, when the administration asked me for my opinion, I felt obliged to give it to them. But I'm just telling you, frankly, how this issue, right now we're going through a campaign, and it will have two outcomes. It will have a victor, and then the question is, how will the victor try to govern, and how will the opposition try to relate itself? And is it possible to get any common consensus emerging? Because societies, I think, thrive on their reconciliations more than on their victories in civil wars. But that's not a precise answer to your question.
A very good formulation, though, that societies thrive on their reconciliations. That's a good answer. Lauren, do we have another question or two?
Dr. Kissinger, thank you for your remarks tonight. My question is that, given all that you've seen in your lifetime, what issues today keep you up at night?
During my period in Washington, I had to be in the office at 6 in the morning, so I couldn't afford to be kept up at night. The thing that I reflect on and try to work on with people is what concept of world order will emerge out of all of this. Because at the end of the day, unless you have some agreement on the definition of what's legitimate, then you will always be driven to force. That's one issue. And the second issue that really does concern me, even though it's totally out of my field, you could argue as philosophy students that many of the transformational thoughts of humanity arose over the issue of the nature of reality, and that the great periods of history, say the Enlightenment, started out, or the beginning of the Christian religion, began with great philosophers who described the world, and then scientists gave it a concrete expression. That was certainly true of the Enlightenment. Now it seems to be the other way around. Now you get a lot of inventions, but no thought on what they mean. And so this creates a sort of rootlessness in the world, which, coupled with the political, those are the two things that I don't say they keep me up at night, but that's what I read about at night when I read.
Perhaps I could just intervene with a kind of half a question, something that you said at the beginning of your remarks just now. I've been struck by how many intelligent people, at least I'm told they're intelligent, seem to feel that we have, that the idea of the nation state is a concept that has outlived its usefulness. Whereas I wonder whether or not, that world order that was forged in 1648 with the Treaty of Westphalia is not still the world's best hope for the security of people and the thriving of individual liberty. I just wonder what your thoughts about the future of the nation state are. Is it an idea that belongs to the childhood of mankind, or is it still an idea that has life in it?
The nation state at that time, which was a new idea. The war didn't start over the nation state. The 30 Years' War started over which religion would govern it. But it was based on the proposition that you needed a kind of legal system to establish criteria for just conduct, and that the units that existed in Europe at the time were nation states. And when you look at Europe today, when you look even at the passion at football games, they go to the nation state, they don't go to all European teams. In other parts of the world, this is different. That is, but I think to get world order, you have to have some embracing concepts, but they themselves need subordinate. And that's not just a question of need. It seems to be emerging in this manner. So I'm agnostic on the theory of what might happen, but for Europe, it seems to me the essential question is whether they can recapture the political vitality that they had when they were organizing the world as nation states. That, I think, is the key to their future.
Maybe one more question if there are any other questions.
Do you see this current deterioration of intellectual debate in the academy as a permanent feature, or do you see it as inherently unstable? And how do you think that the other parts of society are likely to react in terms of either reducing its support for the academy or developing alternative forms of intellectual discourse, and what might those take?
My instinct is that other parts of the society will want something to believe in and not just an assault on traditional institutions. That is my instinct of what could happen. But it would be much preferable if it were achieved by democratic means and not by civil war-like confrontations.
Thank you, Henry.